Welcome, benvenuti. This event will be in English to allow us to interact with our esteemed English-speaking guests. My name is Filippo Santoni De Sio. I'm a researcher in ethics of technology at the University of Delft in the Netherlands, and I'm honored and happy to be given the possibility to moderate this panel on design philosophies in dialogue. Technology, philosophy, and design. What they got to do with each other? That's a bit of the question we're trying to answer today with our guests, which I will introduce based on the distance from which they come from. So we'll start from Laura Forlano, who's professor of design and many other things at Northeastern University in the US. And we have Steven Umbrello from the University of Torino, researcher in philosophy, and Marialuce Lupetti, who is a associate professor in still assistant. You're presented as associate. That's what wishful thinking. That we all wish that you will be soon associate. Assistant professor in critical design and many other things at the Politecnico of Torino. So first of all, maybe it's good to start with the way you see each other in this constellation of technology, philosophy, and design. So Laura, what technology got to do with design and philosophy? What's your take on that? Okay.
So yes, hello everyone, I'm Laura Forlano. I'm a social scientist and design researcher. So I currently am in a faculty of art and design, but also communication studies. So it kind of represents the different disciplines. So for me, it's very much been about translating ideas from science and technology studies and communications into design through projects, and then also taking advantage of really inventive and creative methodologies from design and translating those back into the social sciences. So it's been very much of a hybrid kind of knowledge building and transdisciplinary knowledge building.
Thank you. Steven, what philosophy got to do with design? What are you doing as a philosopher in a panel like that?
So we've realized over the last few decades that given how inextricably linked technology is with society, that inevitably technologies will have an impact on society, and therefore society has impacts on how we engage with technologies. And that gives us a little bit of hope, because that means that the way we approach the design of a given technology will therefore have an impact on society and how we interact not only with the technology itself, but between each other. So that's why I think that how the philosophical approaches that we would adopt towards any given technological design will therefore have an impact on society. And that's why we should think a priori rather than wait after the fact.
Makes sense to me. Luce, what's your role here at Politecnico in Torino? How do you connect these disciplines?
Yes, thank you, Filippo, also for having us. This is fantastic. As you briefly introduced, I'm an assistant professor in interaction and critical design here only for a few months at this point. But what I do is really trying, a bit like Laura, to bridge technological innovation with philosophical debate, really using methodologies and experiences from the field of design and other creative practices too. We will tell more later, right?
You will,
yes.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So I forgot to say thank you to the organizers of Biennale Tecnologia. This is a fantastic event, and to the technicians, the translators, and all the volunteers who have helped us a lot in making this event possible. So shall we dive a bit deeper into this conversation? So Steven, we share a bit of a background in Delft about value-sensitive design. So maybe it would be a good starting point for you to tell us a bit in 5-6 minutes, what's your take on the relationship between philosophy and technology, and possibly starting introducing something about the concept of value-sensitive design?
Sure. So value-sensitive design as an approach really had its birth sometime within the early 1990s. And that was born from the fact that, as I mentioned in my short introduction of myself, that technologies and societies, given that they're inextricably linked, therefore have an inevitable impact on one another. So value-sensitive design says, okay, we're going to take that as our starting point, and we're going to resist some of the more reductionist narratives like technological determinism, which takes a lot of control away from ourselves, a way of washing the hands of those who create technologies of their responsibility, pushing back against other more reductionist narratives like instrumentalism, which says that technology is simply a mere tool, right? And things like
Is it not?
It's not. It's not simply a mere tool. Yes, that technologies can be used for multiple purposes, but therefore the design of the technology facilitates certain uses rather than other uses. A spoon is better suited to eating soup than a gun is, right? So yes, I could probably try to drink some soup from the side of the gun, but let's say that it facilitates another use better than the spoon does, right? So that gives us a little bit of hope. Because yes, although technologies do in fact have an impact on the way we behave, the way we act, and the way we interact with each other, we therefore can have an impact on the design of any given technology to help facilitate certain behaviors rather than others. So that's why it's also a hopeful narrative. And value-centered design takes as its starting point this interactional view of technology. The society and technologies interact, they codepend on one another. It's not so easily you cannot easily, or if at all, extract technologies from their social, cultural context as well as the time in which they find themselves. So value-centered design says, yes, this is where we're going to start from, this interactional stance. And how can we conceptualize values? How can we work with the people to extract their values? And therefore, how can we actually implement those values in any given technological design? And there's various approaches to doing that.
Right. And that's a bit of the philosophical aspect of it, right? It's the conceptualization of the values.
That's right. Well, what are values? Can we create a working definition when we speak to people and bring them into the design space? How can we update those working definitions to make them a little bit more coherent within that context there for that specific architecture of design? So yeah, there's a lot of philosophical legwork that's usually done first, and then that's updated with the technical stuff, the empirical work.
Right. Wonderful. So we will get back to that. If you can pass the clicker to Laura, because I'm very curious, because Laura has a slightly different approach. As I understand, you are more into critical, speculative, and many other forms of design, and I'm a bit familiar with some of your work, but it would be fantastic if you could give some ideas of the kind of work you do on this.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. So I like to think about this approach of critical futures, and this means to take the ideas from the social sciences and philosophy, combining them with these generative approaches. And I'll talk just briefly about a project on reimagining work that I did with Megan Halpern, who's a professor at Michigan State University, around the year 2015. And this project, just to briefly show how these different design traditions are related to one another. Here you have a chart from Liz Sanders, and on the left side you can see typical design approaches like human-centered design, in which designers might go and interview or observe users and the relationship with technology. And you can see, on the other hand, on the right side, the participatory design tradition, where the user is considered as a partner. And this tradition, one of the histories is the Scandinavian tradition, as you can see on the right, and that started in the 1970s with workers within companies designing their own technologies. So building on the on the participatory design research, and also in the upper left-hand side, you can see the critical design tradition, which comes from, some of which, of course, you have from the Royal College of Art and speculative design. So just to give you a sense. So what we did in this project is we created a game that went 3,000 years into history, and we then invited a group of social and economic justice advocates to come play this game at the Institute of Design at IIT in Chicago. And through playing the game, the participants were making fictional objects. So for example, if at the point in the game that they would arrive in, for example, ancient Greece, you would have ways of inventing new, for example, uniforms for the fishermen in ancient Greece. So the social and economic justice advocates would use the knowledge that they have today about the values that they're trying to advocate for, especially underrepresented workers, youth, formerly incarcerated workers, women, domestic care workers, and then they would imagine, how could they make interventions into history. So it was a purely exploratory process. And then in the second part of the workshop, we asked them, what kinds of new artificial intelligence technologies might support the workers that they cared about. And through the prototyping using everyday materials like cardboard boxes and markers, you can see some pictures there, these social and economic justice groups, they came up with some really interesting prototypes, and they asked the question, what if workers could use technologies that they could surveil their employers rather than being surveilled by AI? So that's the kind of question we're asking today in both studies of labor, studies of technology. So here is an invention that was created in the workshop. You can see a sketch on the left and a prototype on the right. And this was called the Little Sister Counter Surveillance System. So with that, I think we move to the next part of the conversation.
Wonderful. So Lucia, can you help us a bit further? So I'm already a bit confused. I thought it was philosophy, technology, design. Now we have history, speculation, social science. Can you help us a bit more understanding what we're talking about here?
That's okay.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. Okay, so I'm not sure I can help with this. This is very complicated. No, but for sure I can connect very much with the first part of Stephen's words about narratives and imagination, and also the imagination part around work. So in the last years I worked a lot around imagination and narratives of technology, and especially I found myself working on this topic of automated driving, which can be very boring for people who are not into mobility and driving per se, but if you really start looking at this field from a technological perspective and ethical perspective, it's so rich. And so, Filippo, you know better than us. In reality, this work came out of me being part of a multidisciplinary group of researchers, computer scientists, roboticists, philosophers, and a designer, which was me. And together we were trying to understand how can we design systems that are under meaningful human control. I will not explain what that is. It's not part of this conversation. But the thing is, we were trying to do good. We were trying to be responsible, to be ethical, but we were never questioning technology itself. We were just trying to make it fit society, to make the least of negative impact. And for me, this was really troubling, because we were always giving for granted that these technologies will come. So we are going to have autonomous vehicles. That's a thing. We only have one possible future presented to us. So I tried to find a way to have conversations with my colleagues first and with other stakeholders later on different perspectives on automated driving. So I tried to present people around me the possibility that driving automation can have different declinations, where we can have an option where everything is fully automated and other options in which automation is partial. And there are consequences of those choices. So what you see in the video, finally I'll tell you, is a set of provocative steering wheels. Actually, I prototyped these add-ons that I would mount on the driving simulator so that people could experience these add-ons and at the same time drive with different driving automation modalities. One is without automation, and one is with threaded control, one is with shared control, and one is fully automated. And what I wanted to do was to challenge people to think about why we have certain configurations. And the provocative artifacts in this way were really helpful to provoke a conversation. So I didn't tell these, like the steering wheel with spikes or the one with handcuff corresponds to this automation modality, but I made them think about what it could be. And this steered very interesting conversations that actually brought into a series of focus groups I made, perspectives that usually are not present in dominant debates. And because if we read articles around these technologies, we always know, we read that these are for saving lives, to improve efficiency of traffic, and provide more opportunities of mobility to people with disabilities, maybe. But people really, almost nobody really engaged with these arguments. And in this way, I tried to have these more nuanced conversations and to challenge some of these assumptions. And yeah, I think it also worked pretty well.
What is the steering wheel with the spikes? What is that for?
The one with the spikes is actually the one with no automation, and it's a way to represent this scenario in which, okay, we choose to drive with no technological support, but that doesn't mean that we have full control because there are some inherent dangers. And so the spikes are there to symbolize that inherent danger. But at the same time, it was really nice because all the stakeholders are involved, like experts are involved in focus groups, completely misunderstood that. And that was really powerful because the misunderstanding generated a lot of meaningful discussion.
How about the handcuffs there?
And the handcuff is my favorite because it's the more straightforward in my mind. So if you think about the Tesla autopilot, that's a traded control driving modality in which basically the car can drive itself under certain conditions. And in theory, you should not take your hands off the steering wheel, but plenty of YouTube videos testify that actually you can. There are some sensor systems that should prevent that, but people find ways to go around with it and just play games, sleep in the car. And this is extremely dangerous. And the communication of Tesla actually made people believe that this is okay, that the technology actually is safe enough to do this. But at the same time, in the manual of the Tesla autopilot, in very small print, they say, if something happens, it's your responsibility. So the handcuffs are a way for me to say, okay, you have these chains, you can actually take off your hands, but you have a binding relationship with this steering wheel. That was it.
That's very, very, prompting imagination, which makes me, so I'm trying to make my head around what we're saying here. So when you think of design or technology, you are thinking of producing things and objects that will eventually be used. Now, nobody will ever, produce a driving steering wheel like this. So, Laura, what's the point of designing things that will never be used then?
That's such a great question. So the idea for some of these critical design projects is to help society raise questions about our desires and the possibilities. So it's essentially to use the future to help us make decisions today about what we value, what kind of lifestyles, and essentially that's the purpose. So of course there can be a relationship between the kinds of provocative questions we ask and the things that we actually design in the world, but currently these are kind of two different but interrelated practices in the design field.
Thank you. So Stephen, we have both been influenced very much by the TU Delft approach to these things, which is slightly different, at least the approach of the philosophy department where you and I have worked a bit. And one big difference is that what they say there is no, that at the end of the day, even the philosophical work should contribute to producing objects and systems that will eventually be actually produced. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's my understanding of value-sensitive design, but we should do them better by embedding more values, the interest of more people, etc., etc. Can you help us a bit to understand a bit better how that works? What's the goal? How would that work? If you have maybe some examples to explain what this value-sensitive design is about.
Sure. So I usually lecture to two different groups of people, usually to philosophers, and I try to avoid that because they're annoying. And I see some of my students are here, and they usually laugh at that joke. And then when I speak to engineers, they go, well, you're not an engineer, you're a philosopher, and then they usually roll their eyes, right? But the interesting part is, despite how many times I speak to engineers, they roll their eyes at the beginning, but by the end they usually go, we actually agree with everything. We want to design technologies, of course, to be more safer and more efficient, but also to embody some of the values that we hold particularly to be dear today, things like maybe sustainability or human well-being. But they go, but tomorrow when I go to work, I don't know exactly what that means. They tend to remain abstract, these values, right? And how we understand those values, even between colleagues, could be very different, let alone between the designers and the end users, or even some of the indirect stakeholders that may eventually be impacted by the technology. So I tend to be a little bit less technical, and I default to envisioning, right? I like to get students as well as engineers to be a little bit more imaginative, so I default on moral imagination. So I use things like envisioning cards, for example, which tends to be a little bit more of a concrete way for people to go, okay, we know how what are some of the values that are implicit here that we didn't?
Envisioning cards.
Yeah, they're just a set. They're just a set of cards, and unfortunately, the envisioning cards are copyrighted, so they come at a cost. There are other similar instruments which don't come at a cost, so that's usually a barrier to even some industry, and a lot.
They're like playing cards.
They're like playing cards. It's a you could even gamify it, so a type of serious game, which is also another method of value-sensitive design, if we want to call it, sitting down around a table, using something that would have otherwise been a game, but towards some sort of serious goal, right? So I get these envisioning cards, and I play them with students or with engineers, and to help stimulate some of their imagination to go, what are the values that are implicit here? Okay, we could create a list of these values, but how do we actually define them now? And you'll see some differentiation between the group itself, let alone between groups. How does the technology impact across time, or on children, or even across multiple generations? Things that maybe, if we didn't have the cards, would have not been intuitive, right? So they help to at least stimulate thinking. They're a good starting point. And that falls directly within the purview of what is value-sensitive design. It's, let's think about the values. Let's think about who the people impacted are, whether direct or indirect. How will this have an impact across time when it becomes pervasive, very difficult to pull out, right? Which will have an impact on how we open up or close down the type of possibilities that future designers will have, right? Because the impacts of today create a scaffolding which opens up or closes down certain possibilities in the future. So usually what I try to teach students is, yes, this may seem abstract at first, but we do have things that are at disposal that free us to a certain degree, that help us to think about how we can be responsible for the responsibility of future designers.
Do you have one example of a product, a system, the way it would be designed according to a more traditional, narrow engineering approach, and the way it could be designed by making it explicit, this value-sensitive approach?
Sure. There is an example, and it's a Delft example, I would say, is you can find now on the market types of headsets or buds that are used to help stimulate sleep or help to facilitate people who have a hard time falling asleep. So normally, I wouldn't say it would be traditional to invite a large group of stakeholders into the design space and elicit some of their values, what they find important, the different accessibility issues that may be involved there. So we see a lot of headsets that, for me, for example, are very, very uncomfortable. I can't wear them. But Bose, which I would consider one of the largest companies, if not probably the largest in terms of the creation of headsets or sleep buds, did do a participatory approach that would fall within the purview of value-sensitive design to figure out what kind of devices would eventually be connected to this. Should it depend on the device itself? Should it have some sort of redundancy or backup? How would it fit into the different types of ears? Because things like even cochlear implants usually are made to measure, right? But how can we provide a marketable, more diffuse option that doesn't require bespoke customization? So providing within the package the different types of fittings that would fit in different types of ears for people of different age groups. How about someone who has an infant child? They need to be able to hear the child cry despite having earbuds that are purposefully made to block out sound, so at a certain decibel level that they allow certain sound to get through, or even the sound of a fire alarm, which I would say needs to be taken into account in order to augment the value of safety of such a device, right? So backup power, how long does it last? Should it last 8 hours? Should it last 5 hours? Well, maybe some people don't sleep only 5 hours, they need to sleep 8 hours. So trying to find that happy medium, never perfection, but always progress in terms of how we confront these type of different values that we want to include in any given design.
Right. That's interesting. So you have values, you can analyze values from a philosophical point of view, reflecting on what is freedom, what is well-being, what is inclusivity, justice. Then you have to check how these values are perceived by specific stakeholders or users, and then you try to design these values into...
Yeah, how do the technical design limitations and requirements, how can you translate things that are otherwise abstract into real, concrete design requirements? And that's not always easy, and it's usually not a simple, straight path. And there are multiple paths that can take to either translating values into design requirements, or how can certain design requirements satisfy certain values.
Yeah, wonderful. Marialuce, you have been at Delft, at design department in Delft. We have collaborated with the philosophy department in Delft. Now you're at the Polytechnic in Torino. I guess you have a good sense of all of these approaches. was wondering whether you can give some, to make the conversation, spice up the conversation a bit. What are the issues with value sense design? What is problematic, so to speak, about value sense design? What's your take on that?
Okay, I put a new background. I will tell you what it is about in a bit. So I'm going to be very reductive, and I'm going to use this argument only in my favor. So what I don't like about value-sensitive design is that usually we perceive, especially as designers, we perceive it as a bit as okay, things so far have been designed without values, and now there is a method, or at least an approach that tells you there is a way to do things with values. And it creates a distinction between the good values and the bad values, so that finally what you design are things with good values embedded into them. In principle, very reductive. I hope you don't mind. And this is an argument to actually say, okay, we as critical designers actually like to engage with, create troubles, and so we like the idea that values are much more complicated, and it's really, well, you already said that, it's really hard to actually say this is the value, this is the way it manifests, and this is to quantify or specify these kind of things. And actually, I think also what we usually refer to as bad values, especially now also in critical design, we always say efficiency, productivity, and these kind of things are bad values, are corporate values. And then there is human values and the public, what we care, sustainability, well-being, and these are other things. And we tend to divide them. And my view is that these things go hand in hand, and it's not really easy to separate them. So we cannot really talk about access and dignity without talking about efficiency, productivity, because very often for some communities, these two things are really entangled. So what you see in the back is actually a research project we did with some colleagues from Delft. And it's about value negotiations and conflicts in the smart home. So we started noticing that there are some smart products in the home that actually manifest conflicts, personal conflicts we might have. And we use the example of the smart thermostat, not the Nest, but the Tado. I don't know if somebody is familiar with the Tado. So there is a central interface on the wall where you set your program also through the app, mostly. And then there are smart valves on the heaters. And the nice thing is that in the app, you set a program, most likely, hopefully, with some sustainability ambitions in your mind. You want to be sustainable, you want to be, also probably healthy because temperatures in a certain range are better. So you set a plan. But then in the everyday life, you are experiencing your home and it feels cold. And then you go to the heater and you just turn the thing a bit. And you are just overriding your own set values. And so, and you create, and you feel bad about it. I feel bad about it. I feel like I'm prioritizing comfort over sustainability. And so this work started from that, from this kind of thinking, and we engaged with 4 actors, professional actors, and we asked them to impersonate smart objects, using also prompts, and they were acting as objects, and also one acting as a person in this case. They all change roles across the scenes, and it's fantastic to work with actors because they have a natural tendency to really exacerbate everything we think of, and also they can imagine in a way that is so natural. We as designers think we have a great imagination, but actors have an amazing imagination. So we unpacked really a space of contestation and conflicts that is extremely rich and shows the complexity and the conflict between values we have, product have, and manifest, that are also value conflicts between individual people and companies, people and products. And so, yeah, it's not a solution, but it's a way to...
So it seems to me we are adding politics to the mix a bit here, right? Because we have spoken so far as if values are something on which we all agree, and now it's only about translating values into design requirements and embedding values into objects and systems. But what you're saying seems like, no, values entail conflict and tensions, and so can you elaborate a bit more? What's the point of enacting these tensions? Why shouldn't we try the opposite? I would say intuitively, no, we should try to, to get along and to reduce tension and conflict. What's the point of making tensions and conflicts visible?
Yeah, so this is exactly the point. So for us, the intention was to manifest how tensions are present in our life, and the smart home, of course, is just a way to visualize it strongly. But if we think about how these value tensions are present in society, the question then is, if we want to control and plan so that we resolve tensions and conflicts, who gets to decide? How should we prioritize certain values over others? And what should be the institutions to lead to those kind of decisions? And again, in this case, in the smart home, is quite hilarious to think about these situations because there is a curtain opening, because a plant needs sun, and then the heater says, no, you have to close, and then it becomes all funny. But if we think about how these value tensions are present in, for instance, the case of surveillance cameras is always a classic example. We need surveillance cameras on the street because that enable us to be more safe, because we have an eye watching over women, for instance, on the street. I've been in plenty of interview studies about this. But at the same time, we give up privacy for that. So this is how... Yeah.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting, because before meeting you guys, I thought that philosophers were the most eccentric people you can find in academia. Now, designers, honestly, are much better or worse, depending on your take on that. Stephen, you want 30 seconds to since you've been attacked, let's do the political debate here. You want to reply in 30 seconds about the idea that value-sensitive design cannot sufficiently address the issue of value tensions and conflicts.
So you're both right and wrong. It depends on when you're looking at value-sensitive design, because that's exactly how value-sensitive design has been since its inception until maybe sometime around 2019, so it's actually not that long. And that's how, and since its inception, it's been criticized exactly for that, and even for not even making any value commitments. Like, well, what are the values you're talking? Where do they come from? How do we affirm them? How do we even understand them? And there was never really a clear answer for that, and I'm not going to pretend like there's a clear answer now. But at the very least, they did realize that this is where the concept of even moral overload comes in, is that, well, we should have a tendency to push back against the intuition to go for perfection and only for at least progress, because it seems that there is a certain degree of inevitability. So that's taking a little bit truth from the technological determinist narrative, but there's the fact that its starting point is interactional, that we do have that hope that we can intervene, right? And that situations of moral overload will always occur. And that means that there are going to be tensions between moral values, if we want to understand them as moral values, human values, whatever you want to call them, but that human values also include economic values, and that in many cases, the framing it as an opportunity cost comes at the opportunity cost of both in the end. Well, rather, it's only depend on how you look at the time span, right? Does economic gain come at the opportunity cost of human values? Like, well, maybe only if you look within the next 3 months in terms of quarterly earnings. But if you look in 5 years, then the sustainability of the company would have been augmented if you actually included things like safety and accountability and so on. It would come at a long-term cost. It just depends on how also we frame the time span question, that a lot of these value tensions are only tensions depending on how you conceptualize the time span of the technology and the values that are there. So there are conflicts, and the conflicts should be made manifest because that helps come up with imaginative, creative solutions to them. But it also depends on how we look at the time span.
Thank you. You guys, you both live in Torino. You have plenty of time to continue this conversation.
Sure.
I would like to ask Laura, I will call you the Italian way, Laura. And I'm a bit afraid to ask you this question, but I know you have written a book on cyborgs. So science fiction is something we haven't explicitly talked about yet. Maybe you can say whatever. So, yeah, if you can tell us something about your latest work, I would be very curious to hear something about that.
Sure, thank you very much. So what's so great about this concept of cyborgs, and the notion of the cyborg goes back to really the 1940s. It's a more militaristic understanding of augmenting the human body so that it can survive in outer space, for example. But we pick up on the feminist interpretation of the cyborg from Donna Haraway from 1991. And one of the nice things about this concept is that it allows us to somehow integrate both the critical thinking and the imaginative potential. And so in the book, we try to summarize some of the key concepts that we draw from very much, the philosophical or science and technology studies community, and we combine those with this vast imagination, this potential for humans to kind of rethink technology, to think about, and I will then flag, I would guess, the term design justice comes from the Allied Media Coalition, and also the book by Sasha Costanza-Chock, which is another example of kind of a feminist approach that moves in some senses beyond value-sensitive design, and it sort of declares a specific need to think about a feminist politics of technology, and that's kind of where this book fits in as well. So we have these 10 principles that we end the book with. We talk about...
That's a big spoiler. You're telling us the end of the book. Never do that.
Exactly, but the first several chapters are very exciting. So we talk about the ways this notion, this concept of cyborgs, right, which we talk about cyborg labor, cyborgs in disability, cyborgs in art and design, and the way that the concept allows us to have this kind of hybrid, in a way, identity that is both critical and creative. So bringing philosophical concepts together with art and design. So we talk about the ways that the cyborg as a concept allows us to transgress boundaries, the ways in which the context around technology, the situatedness matters in terms of how we understand technology. We talk about, both the real world, what happens out in the world, but also the intellectual world, so to speak. The fact that cyborgs are not only part of science fiction, but there are people today with medical devices that walk around with a kind of cyborg identity. We talk about the glitch and failure and where technology breaks down as a really interesting site to look at, which I think comes up in some of the examples that were just shared. We talk about the need for this concept of not just human-centered or like individual-centered design, but that these vast infrastructures, everything from undersea cables to social structures that allow us to have this mutual shaping relationship with technology. We talk about the labor that's required to make technology work, which is often overlooked, I would say. So all of the technologies in the smart home or the smart city require a huge amount of maintenance and repair and ongoing labor, and we shouldn't overlook that. We then talk about some other concepts around care, the need for new transdisciplinary knowledge, constantly thinking about the politics of technology, and the ways in which the concept of cyborgs has sometimes been misunderstood, and sometimes it's related to ideas around transhumanism or posthumanism, but we actually think that's an incorrect reading, and we've tried to talk about, I think some of the very concepts that we already discussed in this panel. So that's related to the next point, which is really about what does a practice of designing look like when it comes into conversation with the values and the philosophies. And so we present, or this is a list of potential ways that design might take up. So, moving away from control and prediction and perfection and solutions, and instead working towards these more imaginative practices, questioning and possibilities, speculation, thinking about human difference, and thinking about design as a questioning. And so that's kind of a research agenda for a future design program, and there are a couple of programs around the world that are taking this up, of course, led by other colleagues. Yeah.
So interesting. So why more than human? By the way, this is yet another label we're introducing. We had a critical, speculative, value sensitive design, radical futures, a feminist. That's relatively easier to understand. Why more than human? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, more than human is a way of responding to the last several decades of design, which has been human-centered. And the human-centeredness, of course, has been seen as an advantage, of course, when we're talking about computer science and engineering practices which ignore the human. So, of course, human-centered is one way of talking about human values. But the difficulty there is that when we're only designing for humans, we may not be thinking about ecological questions or the environment or the broader systems or the ways in which humans and technology are mutually shaping one another. And so I think that there are different labels that have been applied. One is around post-human, and one is more than human, and other kinds of relational thinking that are setting, maybe trying to start a new conversation and trying to reorient. Now, there are also lots of critiques, so of course people have to read and kind of make up their own mind about what types of design practices that they would like to use.
So it's more than human, both in the sense of going beyond the human as an individual with a predefined set of values and principles, but also more than human as in going to the planet, for instance, and design while having in mind also non-human species, for instance. Is that right?
Right. Exactly.
Folks, I don't know how you feel, probably a bit confused, but I hope also inspired. But the good news is we have more than 15 minutes to open the conversation to the audience. So I would be very curious to know if there is anybody who has questions or comments for any of our speakers. The questions can also be in Italian. Thank you, Marialuce. So, and then the translators can do their job. So don't be shy. I can also translate, not a problem. Yes. I can do it.
Thank you. I have a question for Laura. I have a background in human factors and ergonomics, hence your first picture just sparkled my ears and eyes. In terms of the chapters in your book, I was very much interested in how you conceptualize the way cyborgs interact. Of course, I see that you go beyond the intra, meso, and macro level with different conceptualizations, but there's lots at stake of how we can make this the future a better future in terms also communication, anticipation, that is still missing. Have you explored any of these issues in your book?
Which issue specifically?
The question of communication, the question of how we interact, and the kind of language. I know that in your background you have that kind of space, if you included that in your book.
Yeah, I would say that we generally take a very broad view of technology. So we ask whether technology could be a practice, for example, that is a human and technological practice. It could be, we give an example around reproduction and women's bodies, and we talk about the foods that one eats, in pregnancy as a technology. So it's very a broad understanding of technology, not only communication technology. I think what we hope is that we can update this conversation around cyborgs and create what we call like a cyborg literacy, in which one would use some of these principles from essentially science and technology studies as a lens to view any technology. So we try to do that. But we talk about examples like Neuralink, like brain implants, we talk, which of course could very much shape the future of human communication, assuming that they would work at some point. And there are many, I think, medical applications that are being explored. We talk about the kinds of robots that are presented in everyday commercials on TV, for example. We don't yet talk about generative AI because we finished the book mostly before the last year of really large-scale experiments with generative AI. We talk about the workplace as a site in which humans and machines are constantly being, reconfigured, and drawing on Lily Irani's work, which I know that Filippo also covers in his book, about the ways in which technology and the decisions that companies and universities make, while we may not replace workers, we may actually displace them. So we may create different kinds of jobs, which some could be better and some could be worse, right? So we try to raise those questions about if we start adopting some kind of new software, right? We would consider that part of this conversation about human, non-human work, and who is doing what part of the work, and who has agency to control how the work day, and which technologies they have to work with. I think that this is such a great question, and there are so many, I think, future research that could be done on all aspects that you mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, of course.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for all your knowledge you bring us. And my question is for Lara too, about the ecological way and sustainability way of this, because you speak about you speak about more than human, but you stay in a anthropocentrical way, like human-centered. So and with this, you bring like the center in the technology and cyber. So how can we have an ecological, ethical way of technology, of cyber and everything, like to not to stay just in human and technology center, but to bring the center, to expand the center actually, like to have a not a unique center, but a center that brings everyone, and like every everyone.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you are completely on the right track with the way that you're describing these relationships. I think in one sense, more than human approaches are supposed to be questioning human-centered approaches, and it's supposed to say that both humans and nature are also mutually shaping one another. Like there is no such thing anymore of pure nature because of the huge impact that human life has made on the planet, and thus there are, I would say, new design practices that are being created at universities around the world, and probably also in practice, and maybe even by other disciplines that, like urban planning, that where maybe they have a sense of how cities might create new relationships between humans and nature. My area of expertise is really more around the digital and the computational, so that's the relationship that I think the most about. But I would say that it's a very good question on whether or not new design practices that decenter the human, whether we're talking about technology or nature, can we use the same new design practices, or do we need really completely different design practices with completely different disciplines? Like maybe we need soil scientists or we need biologists. And there is a huge area right now called biodesign, where I think you have a lot of really interesting groups coming together, and I think it fits within a more than human approach. But it is still a very new discipline. There's a conference, an event called Biodesign Challenge that takes place every year in June, and it's a global community of designers who are exploring, like, how can we create new materials out of, the shells of mussels or something, really interesting questions. A little bit outside my expertise, but yeah, I think you're on the right track.
Are there other comments, questions for any of the speakers? Yeah, of course.
I am, in the moment, very interested in the transformation of the schools in Italy. There is one new approach that is, again, looking very much to integrating the design, the actual design of the classrooms into a new approach of teaching. On the other hand, we also, in the moment, have a lot of money going into bringing more technology into the schools. So with what strategy of design we can, because it's happening all very quickly, with what strategy of design can we prevent that these investments are spent in this urge of time in absurd ways, like when there was the COVID, the schools they received chairs with wheels just because they thought now. But I still didn't understand how they came to. In the school of my daughter now, they are chairs with rolls and they're not used. It was, of course, it was an emergency. So, how can we help this process to have some really effectful change of our schools?
If that's okay, I'm going to respond to this also because it's very close to my heart. Not just because I'm Italian and I experienced this, and I also was watching news about all these huge investments during COVID and all the furniture being replaced, and such a shameful thing. And so I did my PhD in educational robotics, and what I noticed in schools is that there is always the robot cabinet. So there is huge amount of money for buying technology for classrooms. Very often this technology is tablets, of course, smart whiteboards, and then robots. Funny thing is that there is maybe some months in which teachers put a huge amount of effort in learning how to use these robots, and then they do some pilots activities, and then there is the cabinet, which is where the robots end up for the rest of their life. And during my PhD, I was so annoyed by this, and so much hype around robotics, educational robotics. Everybody should learn robotics. And it's like, yeah, I think this morning in your talk also somebody asked about this, and I was like, we can do so much with so little technology. And so in my case, I took something super simple, and I focused all my effort in doing critical thinking activities around robotics. And the things you need are so little. And to answer your question, I think the thing is that as designers, very often we think we can solve everything, but for these, we don't need design interventions. Sometimes we can be creative and try to steer, like what to put on a budget for a program when you apply for fundings, but at the same time is a political decision again. And all this, I think in Italy there is a huge pressure for bringing technology in the classroom that is starting to fade in other countries. Like in the Netherlands, for instance, because I have experience there, there is a counter trend, like where the people are really worried about seeing tablets and screens in the schools. So they are trying to remove all that and make sure that the education is outdoor education, hands-on education, and technology is limited to specific programs. So I think we have a lot to do in that, and sometimes not design interventions per se. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. Stephen, Laura, feel free to jump in, and the other way around.
You're saying don't over-engineer the classroom, don't default to a techno fix.
Yeah, and also don't fill classrooms with things that very quickly will become obsolete and useless.
Can maybe Stephen say something about the idea of technological fix? That is something that fits this conversation. Yeah.
A lot of the global problems that we face, at least the United Nations was wise enough to see that a lot of the problems that we have today that we share come from technologies. So they created the technological facilitation mechanism to try to not automatically default to a techno-fix solution. So high-tech problems, let's try not to automatically default to a high-tech solution, because that may also lead to some other high-tech problems, and then it creates a recursive cycle. So a lot of the problems that we have, even if they're technological problems, can be solved through even policy solutions, something that's a little bit more imaginative, right? Some more social solutions rather than just defaulting, well, we can create another technology that'll solve the problem that was created by a technology, and then you get into the cycle, because in some ways it's just a little bit easier to abdicate the hard legwork of doing policy work.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, I know it makes it even more complex, but I have a paper called Participation is Not a Design Fix for Machine Learning. So with AI and with the desire to be having ethical, human-centered AI, a lot of computer science departments are saying, no, we have to include users more directly in the design. And on the one hand, we said, oh yeah, that's a great idea, that maybe we can include values. But at the same time, with some of these technologies, they're so vast and the data sets are so huge and the bias is so large that no amount of human intervention may redirect them correctly. So there's just such a huge opportunity for harm that maybe there's a different response, and sometimes that might be that we need to refuse certain technological directions completely.
Thank you. I know that Tiziana has another question, but I would like to give someone else the opportunity. If there is anybody else, qualche altra domanda, commento da qualcuno? Yes. Oh, Jesus. Okay, we have 3 minutes. 30-second question, 30-second answer, 30-second question, 30-second answer. I'll keep the stopwatch. Go for it.
Ok, volevo fare la mia domanda in italiano.
I'll ask my question in Italian. What do you think about philosophy as regards the schools that designs follows, for example, minimalism or a sustainable design, a fair design? Because oftentimes these are fashions that are followed just to make an appearance on social networks, and not because values are actually believed in. Who are you asking your question to? Stephen.
English.
Maybe you can go in Italian.
English.
So, yeah.
Okay. So part of that question, there was to the question, it seems, so a focus on minimalism. I don't have any particular feedback on the aesthetic design choices, other than that in many cases, if not in all cases, the aesthetic choice is an ethical choice, right? We could take example European architecture. European architecture, perhaps in North America in particular, we don't have a lot of examples of European architecture. It costs a lot of money to do that, and there's historical reasons, but also there's material cost reasons, the difficulty in implementing that. But many people from around the world come to Europe simply to look at buildings. So to frame that as an opportunity cost is ridiculous. It doesn't play out in the real world. The economic value of the buildings is not only in the direct cost of building, but it brings value over centuries. So to pretend like that we choose, minimalism, right? Not only because it looks nice, but because it costs less. The fact that it costs less isn't, it depends again on the time scale, on what's the time scale that we're looking at. Is it a value maybe for today, maybe in this quarterly earnings, maybe only because we're looking to invoice the customer, right? But will it have impacts across centuries? Because thankfully our ancestors here built those buildings because it brings value 500 years after. Yeah. It's an example of thinking across generations. Many of the buildings that we see today weren't even possible to be completed when they were conceptualized, but our forebears had at least the wisdom to say, hopefully they will come up with imaginative solutions in X number of years' time to be able to complete that.
I guess also part of the question, if I got it right, was a bit about ethics washing, like the fact that sometimes this is more of a fashion to look cool, to talk about sustainability and whatnot.
The case, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe if you guys want to also answer that, maybe Stephen or anybody else. if anybody has a strong opinion on these things. Yeah.
I think this also connects to what Laura was saying, that with participatory design, for instance, this is what's being criticized right now, that there is a participation washing, which is the next phase of ethics washing. So every time there is a new trend, a new philosophy, especially in the corporate environment, there is an urge to try and define a mechanism for fixing this and to tick the box to say we are doing it correct, so we can go on with our plan and vision. And this is a risk. This is a reality, actually, in the majority of professional, especially environments, but also in universities. Very often we try to be more committed, and sometimes it's a matter of personal dedication, activism. That I think the world of design, especially somehow, is changing, and there is more space for activism. There is a lot of campaigns, for instance, around AI, where not only designers, experts from any discipline that actually is building campaigns, for instance, against surveillance technologies, against killer robots, and these are becoming a reality. And there is a lot of actual work going into technological refusal, for instance. And this is becoming real, also thinking that we can say, no, these technologies can be banned. And there is a history of technological banning, but we don't talk about it. We don't teach it in school. But it's so important to understand that this is possible. So I think there is this washing and risk of being really like a facade kind of thing, but there is a lot we can do. Yes, go.
If you are right, we will take 2 more minutes to take 2 last questions, because I really want everybody to have the opportunity to ask questions. So please.
Yes, I'll try to be quick, but it's something that resonated very quickly when Laura said that artificial intelligence is based on machine learning, on huge amount of data, and a lot of inference on this data that becomes impossible to understand. And that's the scary part for me, but it's more a philosophical fear, in the sense that, I don't know, in the past, you want to criticize nuclear power. Well, start studying and you will learn the intricacies and the aspect. You want to criticize international politics. Well, there are a lot of books to read. Now, do you want to criticize artificial intelligence? Sorry, no. Not even the experts know how it works. And my fear is that this becomes really not a problem, but a feature. We are relieved of the responsibility of understanding what we are doing, in the sense that not even the experts know how it works. It's not a question, it's just something that resonated with what I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Laura, you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I would share the concern, because currently there's so much money going into, university curriculums to emphasize AI, and what we really need to be, the questions we really need to ask, and I think this is going back to Marialuce's presentation also, is like, who's telling the stories about AI, and then what are the counter narratives that we might be able to come up with? And I always tell my students, what are the counter narratives of the counter narratives? And then we can start talking about first order, second order, and third order implications of these technologies, and we can document the kinds of harms that are occurring because these technologies are already out in the world, and hopefully use those examples as a way to make, create evidence of the types of systems that we want.
Allora, solo 2 cose.
A few comments. I share what Stephen said on technology. I'd like to ask, how is the emotional part important in philosophy and design?
I haven't worked on the affective elements of technology, so on affect. There are experts on that. I would be incompetent to be able to provide any kind of feedback on that.
Luce, Laura, any comments on the emotional implications for design?
Okay, so it's not my focus of research, well, to some extent, but in TU Delft, for instance, in the design school, there are big professors who actually found their career around emotions in design. And actually, I find it really useful to look at that space when it comes to robotics, Because there is a lot of empirical studies saying that things can work very well, and people can work alongside robots in a confined space and be efficient, and all these measurable things. And proxemics says people feel safe around these kind of robots, and then you do a study, they actually do things the way they are supposed to do in the empirical things, but at the same time, if you ask them and you want to understand the qualitative perception of the experience, they tell you, yes, but this is absolutely disturbing. Like, I did recently in the last year a study with the Spot robot, the robot dogs, and this was exactly the result. Like, measurement says, great, fine, everything works. But then talk to people and they say, yeah, but this is totally uncomfortable. I don't know why exactly we should accept something like that. What's the intention behind things? So there is a huge presence of emotions. And sometimes we tend to say, to consider emotions as a secondary thing to measurable outcomes and performances in experience of technology. But I think we need to understand much more what is behind those emotions, what is that we are not understanding enough there. Sorry.
Thank you. Laura Forlano, thank you very much for joining us all the way from the US. Stephen
Thank you.
Umbrello, Marialuce, Lupetti, thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody for the great
Thanks, everyone.
conversations, and enjoy the rest of the event.